My name is Ellen Amster. I'm the Hannah Chair in the History of Medicine, and I organize the Hannah History of Medicine series. I wanted to tell you about the last speaker in our series, which is Carla Nappi, who's coming to us from the University of Pittsburgh. Her talk is called Prepositional Bodies, Manchu Chinese Medicine in the Early Modern Period. And there are copies of the poster over here next to the cookies if you want to take one, help yourself with some information. Welcome. And this will be on Wednesday, March 13th, also from 3 to 5 in downstairs in 1A4 in HSC or MUMC, the health center, the hospital, instead of MDCL. So I hope we'll see you again for the last speaker. And now it's my great pleasure to turn to our intrepid speaker for today, who has braved the snow in order to come to us from Utica College. So Clemmie Harris is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Utica College, where he teaches interdisciplinary courses in African American urban history, African diasporic history, and public affairs. Harris holds a PhD in history from University of Pennsylvania with graduate certificates in urban studies and Africana studies, and he received his degree in 2013. He has fellowships for research in areas such as democracy, citizenship, and constitutionalism. His current book manuscript under contract, University of Pennsylvania Press, is entitled Reconstructing Philadelphia, The Persistence of Racism and the African American Struggle for Political Leverage and Civil Rights, which is a case study that examines the roles of electoral and protest politics in the struggle for racial equality in the urban North from the Great Migration from the South to the 1980s. His second book project is a historical analysis of the politics and policies of Philadelphia's first two-term African-American mayor, W. Wilson Good Sr. So the thing about Dr. Harris that's particularly interesting is that he doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. So before earning his PhD, Dr. Harris was a policeman. He worked as a high-level aide to the governor of New York, where he helped shape a host of social and economic reforms, including drug law reform, reform to New York City's racial profiling policy, economic justice initiatives such as the 2010 Business Diversification Act, the state's first chief diversity officer, and the creation of the nation's strongest minority and women-owned business program. So it's my great pleasure to introduce a great scholar and my old friend, Dr. Clemmie Harris.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I want to thank Professor Ellen Amster, my good friend and former running mate, as well as those who have put on the Hannah History of Medicine and Medical Humanities Speaking Series for this wonderful opportunity. I'd like to say also that my talk seeks to reset the way we discuss politics. I want to assert that politics is more than a discussion as to the political feasibility and or policy outcomes of core principles that underpin a group's values or belief system. The balance of a healthy democracy, I believe, is directly tied to the politicization of ideas. Equally important when the politicization of hate becomes weaponized in the forms of sustained hot rhetoric rooted in alternative facts and unjustified acts like that of domestic terrorism, the public health or well-being of all democratic societies becomes a paramount issue of all informed members of the polity. Let me begin. In January 1912, Dr. Richard R. Wright, Jr., a nationally renowned black activist from South Philadelphia and one of the city's most influential scholars, delivered the first of a series of highly publicized lectures at the University of Pennsylvania on what was popularly termed the sociological attitude of Negro problems, admonishing his audience to become widely acquainted with the history and condition of people in various parts of the world as a safeguard from what he called national, sectional, racial, and political bias. Wright claimed that what African Americans faced were not Negro problems. Rather, it was a larger societal problem rooted in maladjustment to the American environment. The problem, he continued, was not one of ignorance, illiteracy, poverty, vice, immorality, or industrial inefficiency, for these were conditions shared by large numbers of white immigrants who, like Southern black migrants, were drawn to Philadelphia's industrial landscape. The problem, he concluded, was bound by racial prejudice. Like W.E.B. Du Bois, Wright was among a small group of radical social reformers during the early 20th century who contested the expanding role of race science within the American Academy. Race science provided a justification for anti-black sentiment or quote-unquote Negro problems. This concept, ladies and gentlemen, of the Negro problem not only reflected the entrenchment of structural racism within the landscape of urban industrial centers, the concept was also a byproduct of a global imperial era rooted in Jim Crow racism and colonialism. This is what Du Bois called the problem of the color line. In 1900, he declared that, quote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia, Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea, unquote. A key reason for the large amount of public attention grew from mounting concern around local and state responses to the recent lynching of Zachariah H. Walker, an African American in the neighboring industrial city of Coatesville in Chester County. In early August of 1911, Walker, accused of killing a white police officer, had been brutally beaten and burned alive. Within days of Wright's first lecture, Ms. Lela Walker Bryan, during a public forum sponsored by the American Negro Historical Society, discussed the salience of anti-black rhetoric, violence, and the declining status of African American citizenship. The Coatesville lynching had galvanized the nation's attention. It also signaled the growth of a form of racial hatred rooted in the fear and rejection of biracial equality that had been triggered by Reconstruction and the Great Migration. Equally important was popular as well as academic discourse by politicians, journalists, law enforcement officials, social reformers, and academics in a wide range of fields that included history, science, social science, psychiatry, education, and medicine. All of these fields somehow or another operated off of this race science argument, and all of them corroborated claims that blacks were biologically inferior to whites and innately prone towards criminality. The racial inferiority narrative therefore attributed the decline of African Americans as one rooted in cultural, not structural factors. It justified the Walker lynching as a response to the growth of Negro problems, and it led to increased racial tensions between African American and European immigrant who were residents in both Philadelphia and the city's neighboring communities. Just to give you some understanding of what that population looked like. Between 1880 and 1900, the black population in Philadelphia increased by 60.4%, and between 1910 and 1920 by 58.9%. Right? That just gives you an understanding of the effects of the Great Migration. In 1910, blacks constituted 5.5% of the city's total population. By 1920, that number increased to 7.4. It is important to sort of understand that at that particular moment, the density of the black population per capita was greater than New York or Chicago, both of whom had larger populations. but the population density of the black community was not as great as that which we see in Philadelphia. Wright and Walker Bryan symbolized the growing presence of a highly educated, small, loosely organized, and vocal faction of a politically independent group of black elites in South Philadelphia who reached political maturity during the Progressive era led by President Theodore Roosevelt. They were essentially Republican in their political principles, but anti-organization in their political practice, and thus held no fealty to the GOP stalwarts. Short, these were folks who were anti-party. This group, mainly composed of intellectuals, clergy, professionals, and club women, viewed resolving racial inequality in ways that differed strategically from the black Republican faithful. In mid-February 1912, during the week of Abraham Lincoln's birthday, an interracial delegation of religious and civic leaders, from South Philadelphia tended to amplify Wright and Bryan's concerns during a meeting with the city's newly elected reform mayor, Rudolph Blankenberg. The group presented a resolution that declared, quote, "We affirm that the cumulative effects of high-handed antagonisms, rhetoric, to the social order have been unbound in augmenting popular feelings against the entire colored race, with the concomitant hardships of lynching, mob violence, segregation, and exclusion from broad fields of labor," unquote. They later called for a citywide mobilization of the entire African-American congregational community to agitate for greater civic decency and political honesty. An examination of Philadelphia's racial landscape during the period reveals the complex intersections of local, national, and global forces and the ways in which industrial capitalism, race, spatial segregation, immigration, and the Great Migration produced major challenges for the city's racial and ethnically diverse populations. Additionally, divisions within the city's political landscape and the success of the progressive reform movement in Philadelphia mirrored national trends shaped by a split within the Republican Party between Theodore Roosevelt progressives and Howard Taft conservatives, both of whom buoyed the rise of the Democrat progressive candidate, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson had laid a claim to a special version of progressive ideology. In other words, Wilson combined both the progressive ideas of Theodore Roosevelt and others to present a democratic version of progressivism as a counter to the Republicans who were running for the presidency. Drawn, ladies and gentlemen, to the reform movement's egalitarian principles, Philadelphia's black progressives saw the liberal bipartisan coalition as an opportunity to leverage the votes they influence and to advance a racial agenda that had gone unsupported under previous conservative Republican administrations. Black progressives also believed that government had a responsibility to resolve systemic social problems within the city's civic and political landscape that were responsible for inflaming anti-black sentiment. Today's talk examines the role of African-American independent electoral politics as a key liberal swing vote in American politics writ large, their complex relationship with white progressives, and the battle for civil rights liberalism in the urban North during the early 20th century. By civil rights liberalism, I mean the legal and political rights promised in the 14th and 15th Amendments, and those within the Pennsylvania Civil Rights Statute of 1887, all of which included protection from police brutality, lynching and all forms of white vigilantism, including race riots, protection from barriers to voting, to include barriers to racial representation in party structures and formal positions in government, as well as equal opportunity in all areas of life, including the workplace, public education, and all forms of public consumption. As we know, it would not be until the Civil Rights era when blacks would formally achieve the civil rights that the 14th and 15th Amendments had promised. More broadly, my talk on Philadelphia is used to make a larger set of arguments about the making of Black political culture in the industrialized North during this progressive era. It uncovers the central role that community-based politics played as a platform for preserving local Black political power during a period when political reform measures by white Northern progressives mimicked the disenfranchisement strategies of Southern white Democratic segregationists. I argue that Blacks were induced by egalitarian principles of urban progressivism, but ultimately realized that while social progressives provided an important platform to address socioeconomic and sociopolitical inequalities associated with African American citizenship, political progressives offered the opposite effect. Additionally, it argues that the political transformations which gave rise to Black progressives in Philadelphia reflected a national story. I further suggest that the shift to Wilsonian progressivism is the most critical moment for understanding how presidential politics directly and openly spurred the institutionalization of white supremacy, racism, bigotry, and violence within the nation's political and civic structures. Wilson's election reveals how the reaction of Reconstruction between white Southern segregationists in the Democratic Party and white Northern progressives in the political reform movement, what 19th century historians like C. Van Woodward calls reconciliation, continued to play out in the early 20th century. His election, that being Wilson, which occurred during a time when Blacks were shut out of both houses of Congress, and his racial policies, which called for segregation within all levels of the federal government, shifted the battle over the meaning and fair application of the 14th and 15th Amendments solely to the industrialized urban North and local Black political forces who fought to wield the ballot to fight for civil rights. Finally, I suggest that the racial and political tensions unleashed by global forces, such as industrial capitalism, immigration, and migration during the Wilsonian era, remains a crucial lens for understanding how fear of political, social, and economic displacement within a white majority can be triggered by sustained calls for equality and integration from a racialized minority. This complex intersection shaped a culture of intolerance, hostility, and violence throughout much of the 20th century. Indeed, ladies and gentlemen, today, when we look at current tensions around deindustrialization, globalization, and immigration, we can see a familiar picture that harkens us back to the early 20th century. When you consider the ominous effects from fear of displacement that are presently being stoked by false claims, hostile rhetoric on social media, and the support both receive on the Fox 24-hour news cycle. This toxic outcome has triggered widespread racism, anti-Semitism, bigotry, and sexism within a white nationalist and at times violent populist movement with global dimensions and dire implications regarding the public health of the nation's political and civic structures, as well as its democratic institutions. During the evening of February 12th, Lincoln's birthday, the local chapter of the National Independent League convened a large rally of Black progressive leaders at Zion Baptist Church on 13th Street in Philadelphia. The rally was largely a response to the lynching of Walker. Under the banner, "Lynch Law Must Go," the rally's program featured an interracial lineup of speakers from the National NAACP office in New York, along with local Black leaders such as former North Carolina Congressman George H. White, as well as Black independents, Dr. William A. Sinclair, a leading member of the National Independent Political League, Reverend William A. Credit, and Reverend Moore, both of whom were key Black leaders within Philadelphia's Black churches. All came together to agitate for the elimination of lynching and for improving Black civil and political rights. It was Moore who opened the meeting by stating that the primary objective of the protest rally was to make clear that the lynch law must go. He proceeded with a fiery condemnation of mob law and Jim Crow culture and declared that the elimination of lynching was of the greatest priority. All must be done to induce the nation to protect American citizens at home and abroad. We believe, he said, that the general government at Washington has the power to put an end to this inequity and disgrace that he termed the lynch law. While all speakers agreed that lynching must be eliminated, some differed as to the strategic course to bring about its elimination. Like Moore and Credit, Sinclair saw lynching as a failure of the federal government to protect African Americans, but he also viewed it as a major crisis of black political leadership, namely that of Booker T. Washington. He believed that any man and God would be proud of Washington's efforts as an educator. However, Sinclair believed that Washington as a leading political figure for African Americans was an impossible strategic choice. He argued that the nation's most recognized African American leader did not speak out boldly on important questions that affected the race for fear that, quote, Negro haters, unquote, would burn down the Tuskegee Institute. For Sinclair, any leader who could not cry out from the housetops against terrible wrongs and humanities, which are daily inflicted upon our people, he said, was ineffective at best. Well, Sinclair provided four critical points for his argument. None seemed more devastating than his indictment of Washington's views on the role of the ballot. Washington, he claimed, had taken a position that it was a mistake to have given suffrage to the black race. This, Sinclair believed, was a position that flew in the face of history. He said, as everyone who has studied the history of Reconstruction knows, that there was no other possible way to establish free government in succeeding states, except through the Negro ballot. The temper of the white people in the South made the accomplishment by any other means absolutely impossible, unquote. In addition, Sinclair argued, quote, he has declared that the ballot is unnecessary for the Negro's success and prosperity, and he has advised the Negro should retire from politics. This position is monstrous, he said. It appears to me to be self-evident that practically all that the colored people have gained in education, culture, material prosperity, religious freedom, and potency, and in sum total of life during the last 50 years of pathetic and heroic struggle, have come to them through the gateway of politics. If the gateway of politics is closed, he warned, against the colored race, in 100 years, they will be doomed to a worse fate than their fathers in the days of slavery. This, they would become, he said, serfs and pariah, an outcast of people. Moreover, Sinclair's views on the necessity of an independent black leadership structure reflected the progressive principles of the newly formed NAACP, a biracial organization of radicals, and the political tradition of the defunct 1905 Niagara movement, both of which called for a shift in race relations that involved agitation for the vote and external pressure through direct action. 3 years earlier, Sinclair, along with wealthy white philanthropist Susan Wharton, had been the only African-American from Philadelphia to sign his name along with other prominent black progressives like W.E.B. Du Bois, Arthur B. Wells Barnett, to initiate the beginning of the NAACP in 1909. Sinclair's critique of Washington, ladies and gentlemen, was not unique. Such critiques occurred in many urban centers across the country and reflected a fluid moment in African-American political culture during the early 20th century. At the center was a generational and ideological divide between an older Booker T. Washington, a Southerner born into slavery, who preached accommodation of white racism through gradualism and pragmatism, and W.E.B. Du Bois, a New England-born, college-educated elite of free ancestry who came of age during the post-Reconstruction era and called for protests or, quote, loud and persistent manly agitation, unquote, the latter of which was a not so subtle critique or critical reference to Washington and the Tuskegee machine. These tensions were further complicated by the ways in which the northern migration of Southern African Americans, European immigration, and the expansion of urban industrialization intersected with the proliferation of Jim Crow and the ongoing problem of racial violence within the nation's cities itself. Within a 32-year period, from 1889 to 1918, a total of 3,224 persons, including 61 women, were lynched. This includes the lynching of Leo Max Frank, a Jewish American from New York and Marietta, Georgia, in August 1915. And yet, while the vast majority of those lynched occurred in the South, the North, especially the Midwestern region, would also adhere to what historian John Hope Franklin termed this ancient barbaric ritual of total disregard for the law. The lawlessness of lynching, complicated by the epidemic of race riots, essentially white-led attacks against communities of color. This lawlessness can be seen through an example of that which occurred in the South, which in 1906 in Atlanta constituted the most sensational race riots of the period. For several days, the riots paralyzed the city. Factories closed, and virtually all transportation came to a halt. By its conclusion, 4 African Americans, all of whom were middle class, were killed. Many more were injured, and the homes of African Americans were looted and burned. It's important to recognize that attacks against the middle class had nothing to do with fear of displacement, but had everything to do with attacking signs of black progress, right? That's important to understand. The North, ladies and gentlemen, was just as hostile as the migration of African Americans into northern cities continued. They faced frequent attacks from white mobs. On several occasions, whites dragged blacks off streetcars in Philadelphia with cries of "lynch him, kill him." The riot in Abraham Lincoln's hometown, Springfield, Illinois, in August of 1908 was by far the most notorious race riot of the North. 2 days after the riot began, order within the city was only restored after the governor mobilized more than 5,000 National Guardsmen. However, before it was over, 2 African Americans were lynched, one of which occurred within a half mile of the home of Lincoln, and within 2 miles of his resting place. Additionally, 4 white men were killed and more than 70 persons were injured. Despite the fact that more than 100 arrests were made and over 50 indictments from the grand jury handed down, the alleged leaders of the mob were not punished. I should also add that it was this riot, the worst in the history of the early 20th century in Springfield, Illinois, that provided the impetus for the development of the NAACP. There were also international events that shaped this desire to find a strategy for how to deal with vigilantism in the United States. International events such as the political mobilization of American Jews around the pogroms of Russian Jews also shaped local efforts to find an appropriate political solution to the growing nature of the color line and the devastating impact of white supremacy. In fact, this example was something that leaders like Credit turned to. The political response for Credit of American Jews to the violent persecution of Russian Jews offered an important lesson concerning the plight that African Americans faced in Philadelphia. In a letter to the editor of the Philadelphia Tribune in early March 1912, Credit argued that while African Americans nationally were blocked because of skin color, and therefore incapable of fully developing themselves into an economic force, as had American Jews, Northern blacks, he argued, could develop into a powerful political force. Quote, the Negroes in this section of the country, where they have the right of franchise, have a mighty power in the ballot. Like them, let them, as the American Jews have, remember that no matter how high they themselves may develop, their development, opportunities, and successes are only theirs in order to help their suffering brethren, and that they are connected by blood with the Negroes who suffer in certain sections of our country. If American Jews can succeed in having America protect Jews in Russia, why may not the Negroes of the North so use their political power as to cause the statesmen of this section to come out boldly in their utterances and say, the lynch law must go, unquote. Credit had in part reacted to the strategic way American Jews used their political power to pressure the federal government to abrogate the Treaty of 1832 with Russia, seeking to end the violent persecution of Russian Jews that began during the late 19th century. Local leaders of Philadelphia's Jewish community, like Judge Mayor Sulzberger, successfully lobbied President Taft to abrogate the treaty when it expired on January 1st, 1913. The efforts of Sulzberger and the Jewish American community writ large indeed did prove instructive. It illustrated how a minority group could use its political power to marshal the federal government to act on their behalf. Credit's decision to publish his thoughts, however, in the Tribune also underscored the use of the ballot as a key tactic for resolving issues such as lynching and other forms of white vigilante injustice. The time in which Credit's thoughts were published in February 1912 coincided with the beginning of an important political cycle on the federal, state, and local levels. The most important of these races involved the presidency, Congress, and the Pennsylvania state legislature. The aggregate effect of the mass protests at Zion Baptist Church and the debates that followed also indicates that black political leaders, both independent and organizational, intended to use the ballot as a central tool in the fight against racial inequality in the upcoming elections. The most important black political center of power, ladies and gentlemen, in Philadelphia was the 7th Ward, which had its own fire department, its own banking institutions, a thriving black middle class, and a sizable working class. The 7th Ward had been represented by General Henry H. Bingham, a Civil War hero who had been elected to the 46th Congress in 1879 to represent what was the 1st Congressional District of Pennsylvania. Bingham was greatly admired by Philadelphia's black political leaders because of his recognition and advocacy for black manhood rights during Reconstruction and his overall liberal history. Bingham was also a crucial part of the city's Republican machine. And as the city industrialized, the political machine grew in strength, as happened in many majority cities throughout the country. The residents of the 7th Ward supported Bingham and other sympathetic candidates, and in turn, they reaped the spoils. The reason they supported Bingham is because African Americans in Philadelphia during this period were completely shut out of the industrial economy. It's important to recognize that Philadelphia in this area represented the star or the sort of the standard for industrialization. It would become the place where the industrial fair, the World's Fair in 1876 would be held. And so by the time blacks are moving into Philadelphia, they're seeking higher paying jobs, only to find that the very basis of their skin made them incapable of being able to participate in the industrial economy. Therefore, they had no choice but to turn to politics, where they traded their votes for jobs. It was the ways in which politics and corruption coexisted. The challenge to this system came with the progressive era, when a white middle-class elite sought to reform the city's system of governance. These good government types believed that the political machine was at best inefficient and at worst corrupt. In the mayoral election of 1911, the state's most powerful reform organization, the Keystone Party, succeeded in electing Rudolph Blankenberg, the first reform administration of the 20th century, and it handed the Republican Party a major political upset. However, between 1912 and 1915, African Americans began to fight back against the reform interests that threatened their party. They soon recognized that the relationship that they created with the reformers was a type of Faustian relationship. Not only did they get very little representation, they now started to find themselves targeted by reformers. African Americans felt a threat to their political power from reform-oriented politicians. In their minds, political-oriented progressives threatened to put into place government reforms that would limit African American appointees and harm the Republican Party that offered the best potential for representation despite its imperfections. Two elections, one for the U.S. House of Representatives and the other for the state legislature, revolve around the struggle by African Americans to mobilize against the advocates of progressive reform. When Congressman Bingham died in March 1912, the governor set up a special election to replace him. One of the candidates was Republican William Scott Vere, a former construction contractor who had turned into one of the state's most powerful political bosses. Vere had been elected to the city council in 1898 and then as elector of deeds in 1902. He had run in the Republican primary for mayor in 1911, but lost when the Republican candidates divided up their supporters, and the Keystone Party took advantage of their factionalism, therefore putting Blankenberg into power. But now, the political boss was trying again, this time running for Congress. His opponent, George H. White, was an African-American candidate who attempted to protect African-American political strength. White had served in the North Carolina state legislature, and he had also served in Congress, representing the North Carolina 2nd. He argued to GOP party managers and voters that blacks deserve congressional representation, and through him they would receive it. White had extensive experience fighting against white supremacy during his time in North Carolina, and he firmly believed that electoral politics was the primary tool through which to achieve and protect gains for African Americans. After migrating from North Carolina at the turn of the century, White took up residence at 1508 Lombard Street in the heart of the 7th Ward. In addition to establishing himself as a member of the Pennsylvania Bar, White was president of the People's Savings Bank, the first black-owned banking institution, which was also located in the 7th Ward, and a member of the Citizens Republican Club. Equally important, White held a national reputation as a fighter for his race and the sole distinction as the nation's last black member of Congress. During his final year in Congress and in the wake of the Wilmington, North Carolina massacre of 1898, in which an angry mob of more than 2,000 white men seeking to end African-American participation in politics killed an estimated 300 black people. White, on the face of this massacre, introduced the first piece of legislation that sought to make lynching a federal crime. I may also add that today the Senate is still thinking about making lynching a federal crime. By announcing his candidacy for Philadelphia's 1st Congressional District, White became Philadelphia's first black congressional candidate. By appealing to both party leaders and black voters, White attached his opposition to the ongoing campaign of white supremacy, especially in the South, waged by states' rights advocates who sought to eliminate constitutional protections blacks received within the 14th and 15th Amendments. He reminded local and state party leaders of the value of the black vote when he told them that black voters held the balance of power in many of the state's congressional districts. While White's candidacy galvanized African American voters, he was not able to pull together enough votes to succeed. He faced strong opposition from the Republican machine boss, William Vere, who won the election. And unlike the 19 mayoral race, the Republican Party in 1912 had come together. White also found himself excluded by progressive reformers in the Keystone Party. While the Reform Party was composed of independent Republicans and independent Democrats, both black and white, white leaders within the Reform Party were not open to offering their black coalition members an opportunity for political power. Finally, it was fairly clear that racist forces within the district, especially in the western regions of the 7th Ward, where most white ethnics resided, deeply opposed White's candidacy on the very notion of a black congressional representative. If White could not break through at the national level, black office seekers fared better at the state level. This is provided they worked within the imperfections of the Republican Party machine. State Representative Harry W. Bass, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the first African-American elected to the state legislature in Pennsylvania, had run unsuccessfully earlier in the late 19th century. He did successfully win in 1910, largely because of the support that the Republicans gave him. And they gave it to him not because they were inclined to engage in helping blacks to obtain political power. He gave it to them because he feared that more black independents would move to the reform structure if they did not have a symbol of black political empowerment. In 1912, when Bass ran for re-election, he ran into trouble. He faced fierce opposition from progressive reformers who were seeking to unseat him. Both Bass's race and White's race reflect the fight of the Republican machine to retain its hold on power at a moment when they faced the prospect of serious losses, both at the local and national level. In the 1912 presidential race, there were three candidates, ladies and gentlemen: Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat; Theodore Roosevelt, and the former president, who now ran on the Progressive Party ticket; and William Taft, the Republican incumbent. Pennsylvania's GOP machine sought to prevail over Wilson and over Roosevelt, both of whom would challenge their hold on political power, and the spoils that came with it. Given that Bass faced a challenge from a progressive reform candidate, the machine threw its support behind his reelection. And they did so because, in part, they knew that they had someone who was potentially loyal in Bass, and they feared that if they did not, black progressives would ultimately shift more votes that they could not lose to progressives themselves. During the race, the city's black organizational forces did succeed in developing what was called an anti-reform campaign that redefined the practical workings of efficiency as a meritless substitute for race and class-based political domination. African-American political activists challenged the very idea of progressive reform. For 7th Ward black organizational leaders, the most important implication of the city's political reform movement was the centralization of power within a white elite business and professional class that was geographically centered in downtown, not in the neighborhoods where blacks resided. They argued that the underside of political reform relegated capable black men and women to obscurity within the municipal service, and it held no direct relationship to helping government to function better. These leaders surmised that any hope for future progress was dependent on preserving access of the political gateway to black communities like the 7th Ward. This outcome would be based on their ability to steer the black vote toward the Republican Party. Bass depended on support from black citizen organizations and the local black press, two central institutions behind African-American political power. The clubs and the black press were important at a time when there was still not a black political machine to speak of. The Citizens Republican Club was the central African-American political center, the central African-American political organization. It included leaders such as Mayor Andrew Stevens, whose father had created the organization in the 1880s, and people like Christopher Asbury, who was the editor of the Philadelphia Tribune. It was Perry, who was also part of the Philadelphia Tribune, that began the stepping up anti-reform sentiments with hard-hitting editorials that ultimately exposed the underside of reform. Indeed, in late September, the movement had ultimately found its greatest support when Congressman J. Hampton Moore realized that there was this anti-reform sentiment building up within the black community. He came to them and asked them to urge blacks to turn back to the Republican Party. Equally significant, while local and state Republican leaders who were directly invested in the political profit that they could gain from black voters appealed to their economic interest, they were not interested in social equality. 2 weeks before the 1912 presidential elections, Stevens and Asbury mobilized an immense crowd during a final rally at Equity Hall in the 7th Ward. This huge rally featured signs of interracial cooperation between the white Republican Party leaders and the symbols of black political success, which included Harry Bass, the only black state representative in the state, and Richard Cooper, who was the only black city council member. The success of their efforts was directly attributed to a well-articulated narrative based on community-based politics that featured actual symbols of black political progress and interracial support within the Republican Party. In other words, they were really putting a real important veneer on the Republican Party as a reformed organization. In an open letter to black voters of the 7th Ward, one of the leaders, Bass, revealed that Blankenberg and Roosevelt reformers in the ward had dismissed more than 19 black members from appointed positions and were working hard to beat Bass, the only black member within the state legislature. For Warren and for Bass, the election was based on the sole question of political access. Both issued the following statement, quote, "Colored people, wake up. Roosevelt has shut you out of his party, and his 7th Ward leaders are trying to shut you out as well. Will you stand for it?" Unquote. Your only protection is to vote the straight Republican ticket. While George White was defeated, Bass was reelected with a substantial margin over the reform candidates. The outcome showed the ability of blacks to effectively use the power of the ballot to preserve access to the political arena, and as a result, African Americans succeeded in maintaining a place in the practical workings of self-government at a time when political progressivism acted as a variant of Southern disenfranchisement. In other words, as blacks were being consistently disenfranchised in the South, this unholy alliance between Southern Democratic segregationists and Northern progressives created a situation where the only way for blacks to survive politically was to continue their relationship with the Republican Party. Over the coming years, African Americans would continue to use the tactics from the 1912 campaign to push for more black representation in Philadelphia. They did so to push for black candidates as well as to gain attention of white politicians. For instance, in late January 1914, Senator Penrose turned to black Philadelphians to support his reelection to the U.S. Senate. The editor of the Philadelphia Tribune put pressure on the senator to address racial issues, asking him why had he been silent in the halls of the U.S. Senate regarding the constitutional interest of loyal black Republicans in Pennsylvania and the nation. The pressure convinced Penrose that he had to give his attention to these issues. 2 months later, during an evening campaign at a rally, Penrose spoke about the valuable lessons from the Emancipation Exposition of 1913, which celebrated the 50th anniversary of Lincoln's famous proclamation, which freed the slaves, and the attempts by the Wilson administration to undo the work of the Republican Party regarding black civil and political constitutional rights. Among the city's prominent black independents and anti-machine advocates who spoke in favor of Penrose's reelection was that of Reverend Credit. Credit at that time was president of the Negro Protection League of Pennsylvania, a statewide organization that mobilized the black vote around the reelection of Penrose. While Penrose did not directly lobby the Senate, as he had for American Jews for black constitutional interest, he, along with other Senate Republicans from the Northeast, did indirectly support black constitutional rights when they blocked further attacks against the 15th Amendment during the 61st and 62nd Congresses. They successfully defeated states' rights resolutions from Southern Democrats and Northern progressive senators that would have eliminated federal oversight in the new constitutional amendment, which called for direct election of senators. The decision by Northeast Republicans in the U.S. Senate to block additional attempts by Southern Democrats and progressive senators regarding the disenfranchisement of blacks and the direct elections of senators was in no small measure motivated by the ambitions for political fortune and their own survival. This is really very important when we consider today the fact that the absence of federal oversight that exists in elections today resulted in the gubernatorial race in Atlanta with, in Georgia with Stacey Abrams, with Andrew Gillum in Florida, and the fact that throughout the United States today we see the proliferation of voter ID laws which seek once again to restrict the rights of blacks to vote. All of this is happening because the federal oversight that had once been in place is no longer in place. And I might add that when you constrict the right of blacks to vote, there is a direct relationship historically to the rise of black violence that blacks receive. After Penrose's reelection, the city's black political leaders increased their efforts to eliminate the Reform Party from the mayor's office. In June 1915, one of the editors, Christopher Perry, made the following case for why blacks should have a Republican mayor. Quote, "We draw no color line on anyone, but when one draws it upon us in politics or in any other place, we concede his right to do so, when not restrained by law, but at the same time we reserve the right to draw it upon him," unquote. In a Republican administration, Perry emphasized, the city's black citizens could expect fair consideration for their roles as taxpayers and voters. The editor then turned his attention to Penrose's comments regarding the need for intra-party reconciliation and its linkage between the mayoral election and the national political stage, namely the upcoming re-election of Woodrow Wilson. In paraphrasing Penrose, Perry stated, quote, "Senator Penrose points out the fact that unusual interest will attach to the municipal election in Philadelphia this year because of the presidential election of next year. Philadelphia should get in line to help drive the Democratic Party out of the White House and to ultimately put a Republican Party in place to help conduct the affairs of the nation." As the campaign for the mayoral race moved through the fall primary, tensions between the city's black citizens and the Reform administration shifted from protest to actual physical confrontation on Broad Street in the city's downtown section. In late September, Director for Public Safety and a Reform candidate, George D. Porter, led police in what the Tribune termed a brutal attack against African-American men, women, and children during a peaceful protest march against the film Birth of a Nation, which had screened at the Forest Theater located on Walnut Street. The clubbing of black protesters organized by the National Independent Political League was viewed as the final litmus test of racial exclusion and a symbol of what might occur under another reform administration. In a three-way contest during November 1915, Republicans recaptured City Hall by an overwhelming majority. The African-American effort to oust the reform administration was more than a local victory, ladies and gentlemen. The segregationist policies of Wilson and the influence of Southern Democrats in national politics meant that blacks were shut out of the nation's political structure. During the post-World War I years, many African Americans faced increasing levels of racism as they struggled to hold on to their wartime jobs. Equally significant, returning black soldiers confronted joblessness and the irony of having fought for freedom abroad, only to face the Ku Klux Klan, which, unlike its Southern beginning during the period of Reconstruction, was chiefly based in the North and exerted tremendous political influence across all levels of politics in the U.S. from 1915 through 1930. Any hope for political and civil integration rested with the ability of African Americans to maintain access to the political gateway on the local level. By the beginning of the 1920s, the spirit of black progressivism found a new form in the political rhetoric of the new Negro movement. In 1921, Philadelphia's black political leaders, led principally by a nationally renowned African-American feminist organizer, S. Willie Layton, and local black club women within the suffrage movement, ultimately resulted in the election of Amos Scott to citywide office. This was the first time that an African-American had been elected on a citywide basis, and the architect of that election were African-American women. The next era of political reform in Philadelphia would not resurface until 1951, during the emerging years of the modern civil rights movement, after voters approved a new city charter. The new city charter, a byproduct of bipartisanism and interracial liberalism, featured an anti-discrimination clause that prohibited barriers of service in all areas of government based on race, color, or national origin. This charter made Philadelphia the first city in the nation to develop civil rights protections at the local level. The charter's anti-discrimination protections sought to both preserve hard-won civil rights gains by blacks as well as eliminate unfair racial barriers to elective and appointed posts. In conclusion, as northern migration, legal disfranchisement, and acts of extra-legal repression rendered more and more of the black vote impotent in local and state elections in the South, black electoral activism in Philadelphia reflected the growing significance of northern urban industrial centers in the East, the Midwest, and the West as the most important fronts in the national battle for black political recognition and civil rights during the beginning of the 20th century through the early years of the modern civil rights movement. Finally, to fully understand the ongoing struggle for racial equity, the push for a more inclusive democratic society, and the white nativist response that exists today, we need to look back to these earlier origins. Thank you. That was 1 hour on the dot. Yes, sir.
As a person living north of the border, I know Sparky Little from Philadelphia, period, but they asked for some basic information to the top there. What was the racial balance, black versus white, in Philadelphia, say 1900, 1911? You were mentioning about rapid growth of 60%, but what was the balance? I don't have a sense of whether the black population was 40% of the total city population or what it might be. The other question I had was, you mentioned that the migrants coming north were not getting jobs in the new industrial Philadelphia.
Right.
They were excluded.
That's correct.
An exclusion because owners simply refused to hire
So let me address the first question. Blacks constituted 5.5% of the overall population. Yeah. Yes, but you have to take this into consideration, though. Even though that is small, New York, which had a larger population, the black population was somewhere around 2 to 3% of the overall population, right? And a similar story existed in Chicago, right? And the reason this is really important is because the population density, that 5.5%, which would gradually tick up, never over 10%, right? But it would gradually tick up, meant that in no other major urban city did black people hold the balance of power like that in Philadelphia, because there were more black people per capita that existed in Philadelphia than in New York or in Chicago during this early period, right? So that's really very significant to understand.
So they're highly concentrated in one district?
They're highly concentrated roughly in 2 districts, right? And they're neighboring districts, right? But the significance is that in those 2 neighboring districts, they held the balance of power. That's what George White was talking about. Right. That's what George White was talking about. On the question of unionization, blacks overall were shut out of unions. And so what they were able to sort of retain were some of the jobs that they had done during the 19th century, right? Some of them were boot blacks, others were in the catering, and they certainly developed their own types of entrepreneurialism to sustain themselves. But the big employer was the city government, right? That's the Faustian deal that they made, right? They knew that the Republicans, since 1876, had moved away from representing civil rights, right? It's the Republican Party that, had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So they knew that the Republican Party had moved away, right? But they also knew that in order for them to survive, the Republican Party, despite its imperfections, was the party that was offering them an opportunity to work jobs that offered them at the least a somewhat modest wage and with some degree of dignity, right? And so they made a deal to coexist with a corrupt political organization because the vast majority of them would not be able to find employment in any other sector of the city. This was not just an issue for undereducated working class blacks. This was also a situation for many of the most educated blacks that lived in the city at that time. I think I saw a question back there. I can't hear you. So you did not really have racial gerrymandering in that period. Racial gerrymandering doesn't really begin to manifest itself until the post-1950s period. At that time, you had something really significant that was happening. One is you had the beginning of the third wave of the Great Migration, right? The Great Migration has its earliest beginnings at the end of the Civil War. Its first major period is in the late 19th century, then the post-World War II period, right? The World War II period, right? And then we see another significant period that occurs in the 1960s and 1970s. It's in that period in the 1960s and 70s, that third wave of the Great Migration, where you see the black population really start to soar. At the same time, the white population is starting to go down. Now, in what had been the 4th Congressional District in Philadelphia, which is in North Philadelphia, that had more than 84,000 black voters. At that point is where you see racial gerrymandering. And they significantly gerrymandered that district, moving it significantly into a white district to weaken that black political power. Before that occurred, that congressional district was the most powerful black congressional district in the entirety of the state of Pennsylvania. And it lost its power as a result of racial gerrymandering. But because the white population was so dominant in the early 20th century, you don't really have racial gerrymandering because it's not perceived of as a major threat to the balance of power between blacks and whites in the city. Yes. He did shut blacks out of the federal workforce. So there were many, there were blacks such as William Trotter and Dr. Sinclair who visited Wilson and tried to negotiate with him, tried to enlighten him. It's important to recognize that Woodrow Wilson received the support of the National Independent Political League because he was a Southerner who lived in the North. He was president of Princeton University. He was a historian. These college-educated folks believed that he was enlightened, and therefore he would be someone that they could support. They didn't want to support the Republicans. They didn't want to support Taft, and they didn't want to support Roosevelt because they had already shown themselves to be Republican in the name of white supremacy and in the name of capital, not in the name of civil rights. So they put faith in Woodrow Wilson. And once he got into office, Woodrow Wilson turned deeply to the South. He was the sort of capstone of this reconciliation between the rebellious South and the North, right? And he did so by reconciling the country on the basis of white supremacy. Black activists came to him trying to convince him to change, and he became even more entrenched. The greatest example of this is when he declared that Birth of the Nation was the most historically accurate film of Reconstruction. Y'all know how many people have heard of Birth of a Nation, right? He declared that to be the most accurate political film representing Reconstruction. He was so enthralled that he invited the film's producers for a private screening in the White House. That was akin to Donald Trump saying there were good people on both sides in the Charlottesville attack, right? That's why you hear me say that the Woodrow Wilson moment is so important for us to understand the current moment, right? Because in the same way that Donald Trump gave a type of recognition to the extremism of white nationalists, Woodrow Wilson did the very same thing. Other questions? Yes. Well, that's okay. That's why I'm here.
I'm from Northern Ontario, but are there still sort of obviously place to compromise the principles of one's life in order to sort of...
Let me answer to that question, yes.
Yeah.
Anytime you marry values and the ideas of one's values and belief system, which as they are conceptualized are pure. When you marry them within a political process, you must now engage in a trade, right? In order for those policies to have some degree of memorialization, in order for those ideas to have some degree of memorialization within a policy, they are subjected to a political feasibility test, which is essentially what are you willing to give up in order to ensure that this becomes policy? You know, what alignments are you willing to make? The Northern progressives, social progressives like Jane Addams and others, fought against the avarice of white greed during the Gilded Age of the 19th century, right? Social progressives brought us refrigerated foods. They brought us changes in education systems. They brought us all types of important regulations, right, that had not been recognized because of the overemphasis on capital in the 19th century. But political progressives were different. They wanted power. More importantly, they wanted to displace the party structure of the Republicans. And so they made a deal with the Southern Democrat segregationists to reconcile based off of a principle of white supremacy. And because blacks, because of the discrimination that they faced based off of their mere skin, could not get settled within the industrial economy, they had no other choice but to make this Faustian deal, right? And so when you understand that process, right, the marrying of ideas with the political process, within itself, it's a Faustian deal, right? The question is how you're going to come out, and that is always predicated on the ability of power that you can leverage to protect your interests. Does that address your question? Wonderful. Yes, Ellen, and then Susan.
I just want to steer the conversation a little bit toward public health and ask a couple of things. We've got a couple of students here doing a history of public health. So one is the history of public health that we just finished looking at is the 19th century city, and that a lot of these reforms and the political battles are being fought at the level of the city. And so you're also describing a situation in which there's a couple of very interesting ways that the African American experience in particular applies to this, right? So one is you're talking about blacks finding power through the political process, which was not necessarily a self-evident path after 1848 Europe, where Marx and some others were like, the political process is just, it's rigged, we can't win it, we need to overthrow it, let's get rid of it, let's do something else. So you have blacks who really believe in a political process, which, as you just elaborated, is rigged against them quite clearly. And the other is North Philadelphia, that was this extremely powerful black base, is the poorest and worst served part of the city.
That's correct.
In our grad school days, I remember I was a driver for an AIDS organization, and there's such, in a similar way to Hamilton, the level of city services, the housing stock, the availability of fresh food, the safety of schools, everything takes a giant nosedive.
That's
when
correct.
You go to North Philadelphia.
The lack of picking up garbage is also a part of that.
Garbage. So there are ways in which all the services of the city, which are directly related to public health, are degraded significantly in African American
That's right.
areas.
That's
and
right.
I wonder if you could talk to that,
Right.
about the health status of the African American.
Right, so the health status of African Americans was certainly one of the core issues that Du Bois investigated in.
And you don't know about the Du Bois report?
so-
Can you tell them about
So in 1897, Du Bois was essentially hired by Susan Wharton. You heard me mention her name in the talk, to come to Philadelphia to do a study, to investigate this thing called the Negro problem, right? And so Du Bois comes to Philadelphia. He is not long out of graduate school at Harvard. He had trained in Germany. He comes to Philadelphia and he sets up shop in the University of Pennsylvania, in a closet, mind you, because there were, the color line was also in the University of Pennsylvania. And he begins this study of the 7th Ward. And he looks at the environmental conditions. He looks at the poor housing. He looks at issues of health. He looks at, the condition of the streets. And he then starts to look at issues of poverty, exclusion from the economy, and on top of that, the types of pressures that were prominent within the culture itself, that being the anti-black sentiment that existed, and the sort of folks that were in the city and those who were within the police department. And what he argued is that the condition that black people faced was not per se a problem that they developed, right? It was a problem based off of the structural nature of racism that failed to allow them to integrate into the society. They were denied an opportunity to receive a quality education and to leverage that education within an incredibly profitable industrial economy. They were denied to have medical services in the city's hospitals, and therefore they had to develop their own hospitals. They were denied the types of services that their tax dollars paid for, which is why it was so important to have black people as appointees within the municipal service to ensure that black communities would be treated. Otherwise, they would go untreated, right? That same problem that he investigated in the late 19th century manifested itself across the entirety of the 20th century until the election of the first black mayor of the city of Philadelphia in 1983. Susanna? And this young lady, and did you have your hand up? And then I'm going to come back to you because they've already spoken. Is that okay? Did you have your hand up too? Okay. So y'all have to remember this order, right? And then you're going to come after this young lady here.
I'm interested to hear what you would say might be a comparison between reaction after so much advocacy from the civil rights people who came to TAC and said, you know, you said one thing before the election, and now here you are, and you're even more entrenched in your beliefs that kind of kept on the down low when we were all voting for you. Comparing that to what's happened now, so here we are, you know, with he who shall not be named. You know, and the same thing is happening, but yet I find it very interesting, and I would love to hear your comment on the fact that there are still people who support him, despite all of everything that's happened, so many abominations.
Absolutely.
That have happened since he's
Absolutely.
elected. So I wonder if you could compare
Absolutely.
the reaction.
So one of the reasons why not Democrats, but independent voters like those in the National Independent Political League and those such as W. Du Bois came out in strong support of Woodrow Wilson is because Taft had failed to honor his promises. In addition to failing to honor his promises, he engaged in a wholesale removal of black appointees in the federal government in the South in order to speak to and to retain whites to vote for him in the South, right? They did not support Roosevelt, who was the Republican-based but progressive candidate, because during Roosevelt's time, he dismissed 3 black companies in the South, I'm trying to remember the specific name of the area. It'll come back to me. But there were 3 black companies, soldiers, came under mob attack, and they defended themselves using force. And ultimately, because the South became extremely angry with black soldiers who used arms against vigilantes who themselves were armed, Roosevelt dismissed those 3 companies, right? And many of them were ultimately executed. The significance of those actions caused these black independents to turn to Wilson. Little did they know that he would take a step well beyond that of Roosevelt and Taft. Now, how does that speak to today? It speaks to today because even though, if you think about the Tax Reform Act, right? We were having this conversation earlier where, you know, one of the things that he who should not be named ran on was this notion of a working class that was increasingly feeling displaced. And he came up with this notion on how he was going to bring manufacturing jobs back, right? And how he was going to give more money with the tax reform. Neither of them worked. So why do they continue to support him? Because ultimately, he's not running on a substantive agenda. He's running on the politics of fear. And it's the politics of fear, the displacement politically, economically, and socially that he is running on, right? It is this notion that somehow or another the other people are going to come after you and they're going to take away what little you have left. Only I can protect you, right? He is running on that fear of displacement. The interesting irony of it all is that fear is being directed to black and brown-skinned people, right? That's being directed towards immigration, and immigration has largely functioned as a labor policy. Let's get that clear, right? But the real problem are the very interests who should not be named protects, and that is capitalists, right? So how that narrative has been changed is through fear, but it's also important to recognize that it was fear of displacement that brought out the type of vigilantism in the post-Civil War era. That vigilantism that I talked about in Wilmington, North Carolina, was all based off of the notion of fear of displacement and what would happen if blacks are in power to those who were white. It's that same playbook that Trump is using today. I can't remember who else. Does that address your question? Go ahead. I had no, it was the moment you said that I knew you were, which way you were going. Go ahead.
So normally I have a class at this time, and I'm reading this book, which I have scribbled filling out the back of.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an ethnography about Philadelphia now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's talking about surveillance and mass incarceration
Yes.
and all that. And I'm wondering, because just recently you said that in the past, African Americans have been denied medical services and have to come up with their own. In this ethnography, they're talking about how that's still sort of a problem now, because often there would be police stationed in hospitals
Mhm.
and
Mm-hmm.
check for warrants while people are attempting to seek medical care.
Mm-hmm.
So often people are still being denied medical attention and having to come up with their own ways of treating themselves and their community members.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, you said that this had been an issue until a recent election.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like it's not an issue anymore? Like, do you see?
No. I still think that it is, I think that it is an issue. What I'm saying is that it had literally gone unaddressed until the election of the first black mayor, right? That was 1983, W. Wilson Good. And this is really very significant because North Central Philadelphia, which is the area that Dr. Amster was talking about, was historically and to this day remains one of the poorest areas that had the strongest political representation before racial gerrymandering had existed, right? And in those particular areas, you not only see disparities in terms of services with garbage pickup, but you saw disproportionate tickets that were handed out for parking. You see the disparities in terms of the types of services, public services around transportation, right? And that had everything to do with recognizing that where you see infrastructure that is sound, bless you, infrastructure that is sound is the result of a public-private relationship, right? These public-private relationships are really the functions of capital that seek to redirect public resources around private investment, right? And so if you don't have significant private investment, you're not going to attract significant public investment, which is why there is a need for strong black representation. Does that address it? Okay, I can't remember who else. Here, way back there, here, and then the gentleman here. Okay. Okay. So, yes? I, was there a public health argument for segregation? No, there was no real argument based off of that. I mean, that was certainly the basis of the Tuskegee experiments with syphilis, that blacks could, somehow or another their immune systems allowed them to be these sort of targets or subjects for this type of terrible experimentation. But no, there's no basis for a public health argument within the question of segregation. Yes.
I guess I was just kind of interested in what you're talking about. I think your name was Layton. You said there's kind of
S. Willie Layton, yes.
or I guess like helping, so they're kind of like architects of, I think that was the election campaign.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted you to speak maybe a little bit more to kind of like the involvement of Black women in the political scene, and maybe like come right and say how to make even further due to their kind of like status and
So this is a really important point because Black women, I'm going to get from behind if that's okay. Black women were a part of the community-based political structure right at the point of freedom, right? And in many ways, to understand Black politics during the post-emancipation period after the Civil War is to understand that it was not in a dialectical relationship with the sort of liberal bourgeoisie model that was ultimately dictated by men. Black men, Black women, and Black children. It was a community-based model, right? That's really important to understand. Equally important is the understanding that as the policies such as the 15th and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment roll out, it is very gender-based, right? And it is specifically empowering Black men, right? And over the course of the 19th century into the late 19th century, we see more and more of the community-based model of Black politics transforming into this sort of messianic figure, the single person, the preacher becomes the individual who now starts to talk about the significance of Black politics, right? And the Black church, which structurally is very familiar to that of the federal government, right? So we start to see that model. And then we start to see Black women's voices and the internal political sphere, right, within churches and Black halls and things of that particular nature. We start to see those voices become significantly compressed to the point that Black women had to develop their own political space, right? There are 6 Black political ideologies, two of which are Black nationalism, one of which is Black feminism, right? So without going into the other 4, Black nationalism had always been very male-centric. Black feminism now was an ideology that provided a platform for Black women to reinsert themselves within the political sphere in ways that existed in the early periods of the post-emancipation era, but between the 1870s and the 1890s, Black women have been completely marginalized. S. Willie Layton had been part of that movement throughout. She had been part of what was called the internal political sphere. They were developing political strategies to address the racial inequities. So by the time Black women become empowered through the 19th Amendment in 1920, they now bring all of that experience, and they are the architects of the first African American to win an election on a citywide basis. By the way, the centennial of women's suffrage is next year. I just want to drop that real quick. Who else? Yes.
So you mentioned how there was sort of, I guess, a bit of like a bipartisan divide in the way that they viewed the issue of Black representation in politics, and how despite the shift towards progressive reform within the Democratic Party, there was more of an elitist perspective and more resistance to allowing Black representation as opposed to the Republicans that, even though they were maybe more they're more conservative in certain ways, like pertaining to capital, like you were saying. At the same time, they also had this view with regards to civil rights that allowed for that Black representation. I was just trying to, I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on that, because it almost seems like the doctrines are they kind of like contradict each other in a way.
So think of it this particular way. The Republican Party is the party that wins the Civil War. They are the party that introduces radical legislation based off of grassroots black activism that become the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment.
Can you tell them the content?
13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment granted legal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment granted political rights in the context of voting for black men. That becomes the case. In 1876, the Republicans fear that they're not going to win the presidential election, so they decide to move away from civil rights, and they become the party of capital, and they become the party of law enforcement. Capitalism requires stability. Law enforcement, therefore, becomes the way in which stability is sort of reinforced institutionally to allow for private investment. You with me so far? By the time that happens, the Republican Party has now become the party of capital and the party of law and order, and it has turned away from civil rights. Reformers basically say the problem with the party structure is that it fails to take into considerations of the voters upon which the right to ensure protection within the law is critical. That spoke to blacks who were already insurgents, independents, and willing to vote against the Republican Party. So they bought into the political reformers' message. In the same way that the political reformers did an about face, well, in the same way that Roosevelt and Taft did an about face, as I was saying to Susanna, the political reformers did an about face to blacks. Because at the end of the day, blacks were the linchpin that helped to keep the Republican Party in power. They wanted the Republican Party eliminated. To eliminate the Republican Party meant to disenfranchise black people. So there is a reversal. And then that sent black independents who had already taken out a very critical position against the Republican Party, that sent black independents back to the Republican Party. Because at least the Republican Party were not trying to take away the ability for black people to vote. And the great example of that was in the 61st and 62nd Congresses. Penrose did not support black issues in the same way that he had supported the issues of Republican Jews and helping to push Taft to abrogate the Treaty of 1813. But because of this alliance between progressives in the North and Democratic segregationists in the South to basically eliminate the ability for popular elections of senators. If that had happened, then the election of senators would be based off of the state legislature, right? And if it was based off of the state legislature, black voters are now disenfranchised. They have no say in how to select senators, right? And so what ultimately happens is that the roles do become reversed. Blacks do go back to the Republican Party because the only way to prevent from having the same fate as blacks in the South is to maintain this sort of Faustian deal with the Republican Party. Does that make sense? Okay. Here.
So a couple of things, I guess, moving away from theory to more application, I guess, because a lot of just students we like in, I guess, student government political positions. One thing I noticed is when you spoke about George R. White and Du Bois, you mentioned, I guess, they're after they graduated and after they got a PhD or started to research and they started to do some influence. I'm curious about when they weren't in their more younger age, how were they still able to make that influence? Many of us aren't at that stage yet. We had the chance to do something very powerful now. And just could you give us some, I don't know, tips or advice, primarily because what we can learn from that, we can translate that to our here and now in the city of Hamilton. I think Dr. Ambrose kind of pointed out, there's some comparables right there. So we could kind of, if you can kind of give us some advice to kind of point us in that right direction, or just even some tips or
Right, right. So let's start with George H. White. Right, George H. White ultimately was born during the period of slavery. Right, and so during the period of slavery and during the period of Reconstruction, he is ultimately growing up in a period where all around the atmosphere is about Reconstruction, developing a new political structure that will now seek to organically integrate Black people. So that atmosphere is a part of his overall education and certainly shaped his development. And he ultimately wins a seat in what we recognize as North Carolina's second, the Black second, a significant Black congressional district that had significant white support, right? But by the time we get to the late 19th century, that white support had fallen in response to a white supremacist insurgency, right, that engaged in a violent overthrow of Blacks within the political structure, right? And so White had been a part of this process from the time in which he was a teenager all the way up through. Du Bois largely gained an understanding of this through his academic experience. Du Bois's doctoral dissertation was on the transatlantic slave system itself. And so he started to think about the significance of the transatlantic slave system. For many who do not know, the transatlantic slave system gave rise to global capitalism. Without transatlantic slave system, you do not have global capitalism, right? And so Du Bois started to think about the significance of that development and the whole issue of race and the relative position of Black people, right? So it's his academic background that really shaped his understanding. Then he is hired to come to Philadelphia to essentially apply that academic background in the development of the study of an actual space. That really is important to sort of recognize. Now, what does that mean? That means that for all of you who are students, right now, being a student is as much an exercise in democracy as it is in higher education, right? It means that you do not have to sort of wait to get into the electoral process. It means that as you are becoming informed members of the polity, you are developing a knowledge base that will allow you to engage in a broader debate. The notion that somehow or another being a student insulates you from the broader reality is one that should really be deconstructed, because in many ways, change comes from the youngest within the polity themselves, right? In 1968, for example, it was young students, many of whom were on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, that came together nationally to change the very foundation of higher education in the United States, and they were not alone. It was the sort of uprising in 1976, right, where we see Stephen Biko, who ultimately gets motivation from what's happening with Black students and white students in the United States with the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, and the anti-war movement. Stephen Biko ultimately gets his inspiration and says, we must now attack Bantu education and the racist implications of that education on Black South Africans. And so I really encourage you to see that being a student today, as it had been across time and space, is as much an exercise in democracy as it is in higher education. Does that address your question? Excellent. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. It generates all kinds of questions in my mind. I have a special interest in Palestine. And when Dr. Amster talked about the situation, what I think of is almost like an apartheid situation in Philadelphia, in terms of, it's certainly something that occurs in Jerusalem for Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
And all over the world,
Mm-hmm.
I imagine, well, all over the world. But, there are just so many things I'd like to ask you about. But I was thinking about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and wondering whether there
So one of the arguments that I make in my book is that we have to, and the reason that I start the time period in the 1830s and I end in 1983 is because I want to sort of help people to see the persistence of the struggle across time and space, right? I want people to be able to see that this struggle is also intergenerational, right? And so we see succeeding generations either learning through direct or indirect contact with those who had engaged in activism before them. And that is because the social relations to power, right, remain relatively unchanged. And therefore, history doesn't repeat itself, but historical themes of inequality do repeat themselves because of the social relations to power, right? And so that's really very important to understand. King was reluctant to get into the civil rights movement, but realized, certainly after the lynching, that occurs of Emmett Till in 1955.
Can you
Right?
elaborate, because not everybody knows.
So Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American from Chicago who went to the South in the summer of 1955 to spend time with his grandfather, who was a sharecropper. And his mother had been from the South, migrated during this sort of post-World War II period of the Great Migration, that second phase. She migrated to Chicago, and she sent him back down to spend time with his grandfather. But she warned him that the South was very different than the North, and that he needed to understand that. And he said, I did, right? He says, Mom, oh, Mom, I do. So he goes south to Money, Mississippi, which Money, Mississippi might be the length of this bridge here that we crossed again, right? If you walk past that bridge, you might be out of money, right? But the significance of Money, Mississippi is that where all blacks who lived in the rural regions had to come into Money, Mississippi for their supplies. They had no other place in which to shop, and whites owned all of the stores, right? And so Emmett's grandfather brings him and his cousins into this store owned by the Bryants, and they go in one at a time to minimize any notion that something untoward could happen. The only person in the store at that time was Carolyn Bryant, right, a young wife who happened to be white. Emmett went in after his cousin. They were in single file, one person at a time. And after he left, he got back on the truck and went home out into the rural area with his grandfather. Carolyn Bryant told her husband, who was a World War II vet, right, told her husband that Emmett Till had whistled at her. He goes and gets his brother. They go out into the rural area and they get Emmett Till. They bring him out of his grandfather's home. His grandfather pleads with them. Please just give him a whooping, because he knew that their presence there meant that he was going to be dead. They beat him mercilessly with a hammer. And then they put a round in the back of his head. They tied an industrial-grade fan around his neck and sank him at the bottom of the Tallahatchie River in Mississippi, right? And that attack on a young male became the spark that ignited the modern era of the civil rights movement, which then brought Dr. King in. He was no longer able to stand on the sidelines, right? Similar stories of that type of merciless attack were happening in the North as well, which ultimately induced Malcolm X to break away from the sort of non-interventionist policies of the Nation of Islam and to really utilize religion as the foundation for engaging in civil rights activism. But Malcolm X saw it differently than Dr. King. Malcolm X saw this as a global issue of colonialism, right? Jim Crowism that black people were experiencing was not fundamentally different than the types of colonialism that sub-Saharan Africans were experiencing, right? And so he saw the global significance of it. And he believed very strongly that black people were not just an oppressed subject, but they were also an oppressed subject in forms of colonialism that were not fundamentally different from that which was practiced by South African apartheid architects. I saw some other questions here, here and then in the back.
So often we understand life backwards. You have great understanding of this period in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, we know, is a unfortunate but great case study for redlining and its effect. Here in Hamilton, it's an interesting place. It's going through transition. We have a lot of gentrification going on. How can younger people realize what is going on in terms of, moving impoverished folks out into or along the fringes, and knowing that they could lose social services, their social determinants will probably go down, but how can we make students woke, if you will, to these practices that might disenfranchise?
So it's a great question, right? It's absolutely a great question. So I'm going to start this with a little bit of making fun of myself. When I came in to see my good friend, Dr. Hampton, I told her that, I came in and I was looking for 116 King Street West. And I got all the way out to Dundas and I did not see Sheraton Hotel. And I'm thinking, where is the hotel? Nothing looks like the hotel, right? I'm just driving, right? It's my GPS says King Street West and I'm following the numbers. But nothing is looking like there's going to be a major hotel there, right? But in the process of that observation, the urbanist in me now started to hone in on the landscape. One of the things I do when I go to any city, before I get to the point, I drive around because I want to see where investment exists. I want to look at the types of economic institutions, the major institutions, the secondary and tertiary institutions. I want to look at the housing structure, right? I want to understand what infrastructure looks like, right? I want to understand all of that. And what I saw here reminded me of the hometown that I grew up in Buffalo, right? And in Buffalo, there was immense segregation around these very issues that we're talking about, right? So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is this. The example of the Black student revolution in the late 1960s sought to connect the role of colonialism within the curricular structure of higher education, the racial and gender barriers that existed within the faculty and the administration. They connected the broader issues of the civil rights movement, urban ghettoization, to academic institutions that were reproducing the outcomes that they saw in the community themselves. So the first thing that they did was say that the civil rights movement that were happening in the urban areas, and take University of Pennsylvania, for example, the civil rights issues that were happening in black communities didn't stop at the gate of the University of Pennsylvania. Indeed, the University of Pennsylvania was significant in reproducing them, right? Because at the end of the day, all of the courses reflected the power structures that were responsible for creating the types of tensions that black activists were engaged against in those areas. So they connected the fact that there were virtually no courses that mentioned black history, certainly none that talked about Africa. They talked about the fact that there were no black faculty members. In 1968, there were 0 black faculty members at the University of Pennsylvania, 0 black women faculty members in the Department of History, and there were none who were part of the administration. So they immediately attacked, right, the whiteness of the curriculum, the race and gender barriers within the faculty and within the administration. And they engaged in a sustained campaign, right, until the administration ultimately began to recognize that. They were not alone, right? It was not just black students, they were brown students and they were white students who all understood the significance of this moment. And they connected it to the community activism that were taking place. They developed alliances with activists in the community that were not a part of the University of Pennsylvania, right? And so you see the type of synergy between community and academic transformation that starts to take place. That was not unique to the University of Pennsylvania or Philadelphia. It happened all across the country, right? And the reason that I exist today as a scholar and professor of this field is because of the activism of those that came before me 50 some odd years earlier, right? But progress is fragile. It's very, very fragile. It requires eternal vigilance. If you are not continuously talking about these issues, understanding that to be in college today is as much an exercise in democracy as it is in higher education, and connecting to organically with communities that are struggling. There's a significant immigrant community here, right, I've learned, right, who are struggling unless you are developing those types of organic conversations where you are learning from them and they are learning from you, then that fragility continues to become even more fragile because no one is picking up the mantle, right, the baton, and carrying it forward, right? So understand that as you are here today, it is not that you are sort of seeing things in a vacuum, right? Those who came before you ultimately understood that what happens on this campus has a type of connection to what happens in the communities around it. And in many ways, institutions like McMaster, I'm not saying that this is the case, but institutions like McMaster were ultimately part of the broader process because they engaged in wholesale land grabs and they pushed, this was certainly the case at the University of Pennsylvania, they engaged in wholesale land grabs, they pushed black working class and middle class families completely out of West Philadelphia, right? One of the first amazing things that I noticed when I got to the University of Pennsylvania is that they had their own private police force. I'm a former, as Dr. Ansel told you, I'm a former police officer. I'm actually a former criminal investigator for the New York State Police. When I see a private institution with state political power to take someone's life, I have to ask the question, how does a private institution get that particular type of power in a predominantly black neighborhood? What you start to understand is that institution is a citadel of white power that then engages in a dialectical relationship with the political structure to get the powers that they need to engage in the types of gentrification that resulted in the wholesale removal of blacks who historically had been a part of West Philadelphia. In many cases, the institution ultimately is complicit in the broader issues that you see happening outside its borders, if that makes any sense. I saw another hand.
I think I'm gonna blow off the question.
I hope I didn't frighten you, did I?
No, I know. I think that was like a really awesome. I mean, I'm not
Okay, you sure? Okay.
My question, I was wondering if you could speak to the kind of specific viewers with the social reform government took to disenfranchise abstract African Americans from participating in politics. You mentioned the voter ID law. I was wondering if you could speak a little more to that and also other discrete viewers.
Right, so if you think about, so you heard me mention that even though Senator Penrose did not specifically agree to become a vociferous advocate for black constitutional rights, i.e. Protecting the inviolate substantive nature of the 14th and 15th Amendment, what they ultimately did in the 61st and 62nd Congresses indirectly pushed the black political agenda forward, but it indirectly did it because Penrose, like other Republican senators, were concerned that this alliance between progressives and Southern segregationist Democrats could ultimately transform the Senate. And many Republicans would ultimately lose a seat in the Senate and progressives would replace them. So their support of the black political agenda in the 61st and 62nd Congresses had more to do with their fear that they themselves would be displaced if they did not tackle it on, right? And their displacement aligned with the black political agenda, because if that resolution that was crafted between Southern segregationists who were Democrats in the Senate and Northern progressives who were in the Senate, if that came together, then blacks would be completely disenfranchised when it came to selecting or being able to vote for senators themselves. So in that particular moment, the political livelihood of Republican senators and the concerns of black voters in Pennsylvania and other areas of the North had directly aligned. Now, that's really very important, because as we move forward in time, we recognize, as I said before, that reform is fragile. Before the ink even dries on reform, the forces that seek to undermine it are already at work. What does that mean? Reform means that power has to be shared. That's what it means. In order for power to be shared, there has to be a sacrifice. That sacrifice is always interpreted as displacement, right? And that displacement produces fear, which is why you see historically white nationalists has always railed against it, right? That has always been the case. The ways in which the sharing of power gets interpreted. And this is not just on issues of race, it's on issues of gender as well, right? This is clearly the case. And if you watch the Brett Kavanaugh hearings with Dr. Ford, right? Then you would clearly see what was at stake, right? This individual, who is now a sitting justice, believed that it was part of his heritage. He didn't have to account for what he did, right? You know, you should just dismiss that and give me this position. He was not prepared to sacrifice because of his transgressions, right? And this has always been the case, that shared power, reform, will require sacrifice that gets interpreted as displacement, that produces significant resistance, often within the context of a white nationalist movement. In the case of voting, starting with the election of President Obama, which no one expected he would win, right? Starting with his presidency and moving forward, you saw blacks move into higher positions of power. I was a part of that story. It was the first time that the state of New York had a black governor, right? And what would happen? The first thing that we did, we attacked the racial inequities of the drug structure of the prison system, right? We attacked racial profiling. We expanded opportunities for women and minority business enterprises, right? We basically said that power must now be shared more equitably. And the response to that was anything short of a type of visceral rejection that race and gender would now be a key part of understanding how the American democratic structure should move forward. Because many feared that whites, and particularly white males, would be displaced because of these race and gender-based reforms. When we think about the current electoral period, what do we see? Two blacks that were running for governor in the Deep South. A black male in Florida, a black woman in Georgia. And they came close. And in both races, we saw the significance of attacks against the voting structure by whites. And it was most egregious in Georgia. right? And that was largely because the federal government no longer sought to oversee states and local governments to ensure that black voting rights would be protected. When black voting rights are not protected, there is a direct relationship to increased attacks on blacks because there is no real power structure that will protect them. Does that answer your question? Excellent.
So we are at time, but we still have the room until 5:30. So I want to encourage anybody who wants to have informal conversation with Dr. Harris to come on up and please eat cookies and take them with you because I cannot take those cookies with me. I definitely do not be eating cookies, so I want all the students to take it with you for a study break. And I want you to join me in thanking Dr. Harris for joining us.